I need to workshop this into like a better thought piece, but here's me trying to speed run the concepts and putting them together. So right now, in order to establish more like dexterous movement in robotics, what we really need to understand is how are we like manipulating those degrees of freedom, and how are we processing all of that data in real time. Right now, a lot of robotics is about doing things fast. My understanding from working in physical therapy is that slowing down is actually what helps for an individual to slowly put together the data points as they're moving in space to understand what is the concept of the movement they're trying to do. There's something that's going on in robotics now where we're trying to get like this sort of like task agnosticism in a sense, which is just to say it's a generalized like robot. It can have a lot of great experience and then therefore come into a new scenario and adapt really strongly. And so I think going slow is something that really helps here. And part of the reason I think it helps is when we look at the architecture of how the software should be outlined, right? We used to have, like, if you think about on a larger scale, on a corporate or enterprise level, we used to follow more of a monolithic structure where everything's kind of put together in one big unit. And then eventually we adopted kind of this agile mentality and then went to microservices. So for me, the actual like shift to microservices is kind of the same thing that we need to be doing here, right? Is that we before used to think of, oh, I need the arm to move. Then eventually we start segmenting it into the appropriate sections, which is to say I need my wrist to do this motion. I need my elbow to do this motion. I need the shoulder and the glenohumeral joint to engage in this way with certain like scapulothoracic rhythm. Like I need those all to be working together in tandem. And so I need to look at a certain communication of all of these sort of microservices that make up the component of the arm. Now, this is where I think slowing down also gives us a lot of room, because you start by having the computer try to analyze what is the slow movement and get a large amount of data points to fill in the blanks for this kind of a scaffold, this microservices kind of architecture. Then afterwards, once you've gotten the data points to fill in the blank there, that's when you can start scaling more rapidly with taking in like this big data and compute approach, I think, where that permits you to, oh, I should not turn in there. Where now if you take more of that big data and like compute approach instead, after having gotten like the slow data that's been created, then I think that gives you a lot better room to not have so much room for error. And you sort of can fill in the blanks a lot easier. This intuitive physics, these world models that like Yann LeCun and Fei Fei are talking about, I think that intuitive physics comes from not a scaling of data, but rather slowing down data to be architected in a particular way so that later on we can take advantage of like compute efficiency to make sure that it's actually running all together really strongly. Now, part of the reason I think this is also valuable is when we look at machine learning models for AI, because you want the models to continually learn. That's the kind of paradigm that we're understanding now. It's less about pure reinforcement learning and pure scaling on data. You need to be able to have this adaptation. You need to have a unified and a factored representation that's coming out of your learning model, which is what allows you to be a generalist instead. So I think giving those elements together right now, when you look at how like movement is segmented in robotics, it follows a much more of like this an osteokinematic approach more than anything. Whereas biology is much different than that. So I think that gives us room to draw more distinctions between how is like the human architecture of this movement knowledge, this motor control, versus how is the robot's interpretation of this. And now the last thread where I think this really comes together nicely is ecological dynamics. There's a great guy called Bren Teaches Movement who recently had an interview. I think it's just like 2 days ago. He had an interview with a top neuroscientist at Princeton. I think it's Dr. Reza something, but he has just incredible papers on motor control and how that operates from the brain to execute movement in space. And a lot of the research there, when we talk about whether or not movement is created by an affordance through the environment, it's the third thing between me and the environment, or whether there's actually an internal model going on, whether I have to make an internal representation of it, which is where we get into more of the pure compute side, where I think compute might demand that internal representation, whereas right now in our embodied systems, we don't necessarily need it, or rather, it might be black boxed or abstracted away in the intelligence of our body that we don't yet understand. And that intelligence of our body is what provides us the physical or spatial intelligence, which I think is exactly what Dr. Fei Fei is talking about when she's mentioning that we need these world models to adapt and have this better understanding of what's going on when we go from like a world state to a world state. So I think the last part is with the movement. I think that also will inform the world model that Yann LeCun is providing, because then you have a better representation of what are the nuances in between the data points that create a better representation further on. And so now you're creating a world model that doesn't just predict, it's actually promoting this understanding of it. So, okay, cool. We need a longer thought piece for that later.